This is Section 3, Lecture 3. We're still talking about theories in international relations. And in this lecture, we're going to be talking about liberalism, which is also known as neoliberalism, globalism, or idealism, and constructivism. Liberalism, we can see, has a critical view of realism, and they critique realism on several points, particularly anarchy. We'll see in liberalism that they do focus on the importance of international organizations, the importance of international law, and so they argue that anarchy is only partly correct, that there are many structures that influence the behavior of nation states. They also criticize the realist view that the nation state is a unitary or single actor. They point out that nation states have various actors, subnational actors like political parties that have influences, interest groups that have influences. And so they say or state that nation states don't just have one perspective or one desire in foreign policy, that they have various interests. Another critique is the realist focus on power. Liberals will argue that military power and force is not all important, that other issues such as trade, social issues, environmental issues are also important, in some instances as equally important as military power. And liberals argue that the rules of the international system are changing away from the realist standoff based on power politics towards more international cooperation. And so this is what the liberal paradigm focuses on in international relations theory. It focuses on cooperation rather than conflict, how nation states can achieve cooperation, the arenas in which they cooperate, be it international organizations or trade agreements, and it best explains how nation states get along with one another. So it best explains economic cooperation. It best explains global transformation, a rising level of new issues, not new issues, but various issues in their importance, like trade, social issues such as human rights and addressing poverty, environmental issues, the spread of disease, the spread of weapons, let's say, the spread of drugs, that these global issues are important and must be addressed, and they have to be addressed multilaterally, that is, collectively by all nation states, and that these have an influence on the foreign policies of nation states, not just political power or economic power, as realists argue. And so this is what liberalism focuses on. Liberals also focus on the influence of non-state actors in the international system. We said with realism that the most important actors in international politics are nation states themselves. Liberals argue that that's true, they agree with that. States are important, but also international organizations are important. Multinational corporations are influential. Non-state actors such as terrorist organizations or cartels are also influential in the international system and should be explained or encapsulated when discussing international relations and foreign policy. And so countries aren't just the only key actors in world politics. Here we have some assumptions of liberal theory. in addressing anarchy, the idea that no world government exists, there's no effective police force, there's no effective international court system, there's no effective real constraint on the behavior of nation states. Liberals will argue, well, even though there's no world government, there is governance. There are international laws, there are rules that nation states do abide by. Why do they abide by them? Well, they abide by them because it's in their self-interests. This is something that we discussed with realism. Realism focused on rational self-interest based on protection of your nation state. And so that's why there was a focus on power. Here we have a notion of enlightened self-interest. A view that, yes, your nation state's protection is in your self-interest, but there are many other things that are in your self-interest as a nation state and that you can achieve rationally as well, including working collectively with other nation states around the world. And so there's an emphasis on working with other nation states based on your shared norms, your shared necessities, your shared desires, your shared interests that you have with other countries. And so there is a focus on building that cooperation in international politics from this liberal perspective. The key point of liberalism is that nation states can't really go it alone in the world. They have to work with one another, and this is what this idea of interdependence means. Countries are increasingly enmeshed in multilateral institutions and multilateral relations. Even the most powerful nation state on the world has to work with other nation states to achieve its interests, their common interests too. No one country can solve all of the world's problems. And liberals would argue no one country can even solve its own problems by itself. If we look at environmental problems, these are global. And they don't, the spread of CO2 emissions doesn't recognize national borders. If we look at the proliferation of drugs, this is an international phenomenon and thus requires international cooperation to combat it. And so nation states must work together, and they work together repeatedly. International cooperation is a result of repeated interactions among nation states. Another point that is there at the top that's fundamental, and we saw this on the previous slide, is the shared norm of democracy or democratization. And one of the big areas of study in the liberal paradigm in international relations is the democratic peace theory. Democracies don't go to war with one another. They tend not to. And throughout the 1990s and 2000s, this in the academic literature was found to be statistically significant over and over and over again. Well, we see this bleed into our own foreign policy if you remember back to the presidential doctrines, beginning with the first President Bush, through President Clinton, through the second President Bush, and now through President Obama. We still see that democratization of nation states around the world is a key U.S. foreign policy goal. And so this is something we perhaps borrow from the liberal paradigm in international relations. In the liberal paradigm, one of the key concepts is interdependence, and I have here a terminology, complex interdependence. And this is the idea that the relations and the politics among nation states is not just at the government to government level, and it's not just on forming alliances or standing off against potential threats or enemies. That there are any number of issues and any number of actors that tie one nation to others around the world. And so the first assumption here is that there are multiple channels of contact that connect societies. World politics just doesn't stop at government to government relations. That's very important. But world politics also encompasses the global economy, which is primarily based on multinational corporations, overseas investment, individual consumers, so on and so forth. This is a global phenomenon and has thus a political aspect to it, whether we think about it in that way or not. For liberals in this paradigm, there are no hierarchy of issues. Trade and social issues and environmental issues, poverty, disease, those types of things are just as important to a country as a country's security, and in many ways influence a nation state's security. And so, for example, if you have rampant poverty in your nation state, how are the people there going to react? Are there going to be threats to your security based on that poverty? Are people going to lash out against the government? Are they going to try to steal the resources of their neighbor in order to solve their problems of poverty, or at least address them? Well, that creates an international war. And so what liberals focus on is that how these issues oftentimes intermingle and intermesh together that makes the politics among nation states that much more complicated. And they also focus out that military force is not the most common relationships that even governments engage in. The most common relationship among nation states is the economic relationship. And so they would argue that realists have a misconstrued view of world politics if they focus primarily on national security as the key issue for countries. But they recognize that this standoff among nation states does exist, and that's what the next slide will talk to. So liberals, like realists, still recognize that there's no world law enforcement, and they then still recognize, well, if anarchy exists, nation states and their self-interest and rationality still is going to come into play in their relationships with one another. This is something that realists and liberals agree on, that countries and actors within countries, political actors, are still self-interested and still are ultimately rational in their decision making, or at least attempt to be rational in their decision making. So what they focus on is, if anarchy exists, if this standoff among nation states exists, if you have to help yourself and preserve yourself, if you can't trust other countries around the world necessarily, how then do you build cooperative relationships? And they focus on how to achieve cooperation despite anarchy. And I have a few ideas here that are related to achieving cooperation while still protecting your self-interest and still being rational about protecting your self-interest. And these first two terms, tit-for-tat behavior and reciprocity, are basically the same thing. That is, treating other countries how they treat you. If another country extends an olive branch of peace and cooperation to your country in a reciprocal way, you will extend that same behavior to them. That's tit for tat. You give them what they give you. How then do you protect yourself if a country cuts off that cooperative relationship, if they cheat on their trade agreements or something like that? Well, then you treat them the way that they've treated you. You cut them off. In that way, you are still protecting your interests as a nation state by not being subservient to that other country, or not allowing them to gain power over you. Another way that cooperation is achieved despite anarchy is this notion called iterated interactions. That is, repeated interactions among countries. The idea here is that cooperation with other countries, whether or not they are good to you or bad to you, is not a one-time or one-shot deal. This is something that happens every day. And so over time, if you interact with other nation states, you can learn to trust one another to an extent. You can extend this idea of positive reciprocity into the future. Another way that nation states may change their behavior towards cooperation rather than a standoff with one another is to focus on their absolute gains rather than their relative position. Remember when we talked about realism and the idea of power, the notion of relative power, your relative place versus other countries, was very important. You wanted to be equal to them or more powerful to them so that they couldn't influence you as a country. And so if you had that thought process, you would always want to have a positive outcome, but you'd also always want to be doing better than other countries. Well, that's a relative position. What liberals will focus on is your absolute positive outcomes, not necessarily taking into account the power or the positive outcomes from cooperation of other nation states. And so as long as you're better off in cooperative relationships in the long run, liberals would say that cooperation is benefiting your nation state and you should stick with it. And as long as that positive outcome continues, as long as there's repeated interactions among nation states, as long as there's positive reciprocity, this creates the potential for further cooperation among countries, despite the technical position of anarchy. And so this is what that phrase, the shadow of the future, refers to. That positive reciprocity and repeated interactions and a continued absolute positive outcome for your nation state creates a shadow of the future towards more cooperation and more positive outcomes for your country, thereby facilitating cooperation with other countries.